So this morning, we all heard a very patriotic American make his presentation. Have the deepest respect for Special Counsel, well, now former Special Counsel Mueller, and what he had to say. And as Gloria indicated, he did say if he saw any evidence that the president was not was innocent, he would have let us know. If he had any evidence that the president was not guilty, he would have let us know, but he didn't. He didn't, and I think that was very, very important. While I have the deepest respect for him and thank him and his team for the presentation of facts that will further lead us to help us in the Congress and in the courts, this is a very valuable contribution. I am gravely disappointed in the Justice Department for their attitude, their misrepresentation of the Mueller report to begin with, their hiding behind something that you could never find in the Constitution, that the president is above the law, and their misrepresentations, even under oath, by the Attorney General to the Congress of the United States. So as we will continue on our path, which was led by our 6 chairmen who are magnificent, Adam Schiff, who's coming, Jerry Nadler, Judiciary, Elijah Cummings, Government Reform and Oversight, Maxine Waters, Financial Services, Richie Neal, the President's Taxes, Ways and Means, and Elliot Engel, Foreign Affairs, all have a piece of this. Last week, we had 3 victories in the courts. One, Elijah Cummings court, won the President's accountant, that they have to share the information. 2, Maxine Waters, the Deutsche Bank decision, which is they have to share the information. And 3, not related to the Russia investigation or that, but related to other problems we have with the president and his view of the Constitution, is that the court said that he cannot use Defense Department funds to build a wall, to use that money to build a wall. We also had a victory in Adam Schiff's committee in that the Justice Department, under threat of subpoena and legal action, decided that they would give certain important documents to the committee, and that was a victory. That was 4 days, 4 decisions in 5 days, very important to advancing our getting the facts for the American people, getting the truth for the American people. Where they will lead us, we shall see. Nothing is off the table. But we do want to make such a compelling case, such an ironclad case, that even the Republican Senate, which at the time seems to be not an objective jury, will be convinced of the path that we have to take as a country.
So you mentioned the victories in court. You mentioned the various committees doing their investigations. Some in Congress want to go further. Representative Steve Cohen of Tennessee open a dedicated impeachment inquiry, Judiciary Committee potentially. Are you
Judiciary Committee what?
Well, open a specific investigation of impeachment.
No, you mean he as a member of the committee, because the committee has not taken that position.
So there are Democrats in Congress who want to go further than the existing committee investigations. How do you feel about that? Do you think there's a role for an additional dedicated investigation?
Well, let me just say that I'm very proud of our House Democrats. They've been very, shall we say, conscientious about how they've reached their decisions, and I think it's like 35 of them out of 238, or maybe it's 38 of them out of 238 have said that they wanted to be outspoken on impeachment, and many of them are reflecting their views as well as those of their constituents. Many constituents want to impeach the president, but we want to do what is right and what gets results. But gets results. And we have to remember, so yes, there are some, and the press makes more of a fuss about the 38 than the 200, who are over half of the Congress, after half of the Democrats in the House sit on one of these 6 committees. So they're all on a path of finding more information. Just to recall, many of you were not born then, but during the what would not become impeachment, but the impeachment investigation of Richard Nixon. It took months and months of a Senate committee that was solely dedicated to researching impeachment before they then decided to have articles of impeachment come from the House, which were never executed because the House and Senate agreed. It was a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate. We have a different scenario now. So the case has to be very compelling to the American people. So we are legislating, and we wish the press would cover more of that. Thank you, Gloria, for pointing out some of the bills that we have passed and sent to the Senate about gun safety, women's rights, equal pay for equal work, Violence Against Women Act, gun safety, the list goes on, climate action now, the list goes on. But in any event, we're legislating, we're investigating, and we are litigating. And we're going to, as we go down the path, make a decision based on the strongest possible case to get the best results for the American people. And the action taken by the special counsel today, I commend him for the work that they did to present the facts. Now, we have to get it unredacted for the public, but nonetheless, and for the Congress, by the way. They'll say to me, we'll show you. And I say, that's not it. We want the American people to know. But you're going to show me, and then I'm bound by classified rules of the House not to tell anybody? No, I don't think so. I don't think so. But in any event, I think that, everybody wants justice. Everybody wants the president to be held accountable in the most serious way. And everybody believes, I'm talking on the Democratic side, that no one is above the law, especially the President of the United States.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.